The High Court sitting in Pretoria has ruled that the 2023 regulations governing the 370 Rand COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant are unconstitutional and invalid. The ruling dismantles several restrictive measures imposed by the South African Social Security Agency, which limited access to the grant for many eligible South Africans. The Good Party has welcomed this judgment. Its Secretary General is Brett Heron, who joins us now via our video link. Brett, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for helping us understand what's just taken place there. And that's really my first question. From your reading of this ruling, what ought to happen next in order to make sure that these grants are more accessible?
Morning, Ayanda. I think in a nutshell, what the High Court has ordered, I think it's long overdue, is that there is an obligation on the state to achieve the Section 27 of our Constitution rights, which is the right to access to Social Security when South Africans are unable to meet their own needs. So the judgment really takes a giant step forward in requiring government to implement a rational and reasonable program of access to Social Security for those who are unable to meet their own needs because they're unemployed. But the judgment goes further, obviously, in dealing with the regulations that were promulgated by the Minister of Social Development, which were intended to restrict the number of South Africans who would be eligible to receive the 370 Rand per month Social Relief of Distress Grant. And it orders that those restrictions, which are barriers to access to this grant, are removed. It criticizes government for only increasing the Social Relief of Distress Grant from 350 Rand to 370 Rand in the 4 years of its existence, and requires government to go back to the drawing board and re-examine the inflationary impact on that 350 Rand grant. It requires government to look at the national food poverty lines, which in 2023 was about 760 Rand per month, and explain why that is not the threshold for qualifying for this grant. And it sets aside some administrative burdens to poor people, like the application process can only be done online. So it's a broad, sweeping judgment that protects the poor and the vulnerable from bureaucracy and from irrational decision-making, and also entrenches their right to this Social Security.
I know there was also a comment in this judgment around the budget that had been set aside for this grant, especially when you consider how many people typically would be eligible and how much government has set aside to service them.
Yeah, the judgment is very scathing. It says it's unfathomable to the court how a government can acknowledge that there are 18.3 million people who probably qualify for this grant because they are hungry and they are unemployed and without the means to support themselves, but then only budget for 10.5 million people to receive the Social Relief of Distress Grant, and then goes on to acknowledge or to admonish governments efforts to restrict the number of people who would qualify for this grant, whilst acknowledging that there are 18.3 million people who should get the grant. So these regulations that were put in place were intended to limit the number of people who qualify for the grant from actually getting it.
What's interesting, of course, is that this grant wasn't always around. And my reading of this judgment is it's trying to move government to ensuring that it's better implemented. I know you don't speak for government, but since we're just talking about this, I wonder what would happen if the state were just to come back and say, we simply can't afford all of this, actually.
Well, it's interesting because for a long time, and this is what the Good Party has been critical about, annually the President and then the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Social Development announced an extension of what they first regarded as a temporary grant implemented during COVID. Says that this grant is temporary. It says that this grant is being now incorporated into the Social Security Act or the Social Assistance Act, where all the other are identified and legislated. And the court says that this is not a temporary grant. This is a grant that is in place in terms of Section 27 of the Constitution to provide social assistance to those who are unable to meet their basic needs. The foundation for government to implement a basic income grant, which they have been talking about for decades and have made little progress in implementing. Clear that this is not a temporary grant in our social security system, and it needs to be managed as part of the social security system.
If the government were to announce in the future that they're actually doing away with this grant, they'd be acting unconstitutionally.
I think in terms of this judgment, which is a High Court judgment and may well still end up being tested in the Constitutional Court.
Right.
But the judgment is really quite firm and strong that there's an obligation, and I think many of us know that there's an obligation on the state to proactively achieve socioeconomic rights that are in our Constitution. We saw this right back 20 years ago with the Grootboom case around housing. I don't think it's ever really been tested around social security. So this is a major step forward in saying social security is also a constitutional right. It's a socioeconomic right. And there's now a duty on the state, according to this judgment, to progressively realize that right. So I don't think it's open to government to suddenly say we're doing away with it.
As you mentioned, it is a High Court ruling, and we live in a very litigious country. It may take some time before there's finality on at least the High Court's interpretation here. The question really is, how long do you think it will take before we start seeing material change in reducing these barriers so that the people who, in fact, do need this grant can have access to it in a fair manner, so to speak?
Well, it was interesting. If you read the judgment, it was clear that the respondents, who were the state departments, social development, SASSA, National Treasury, they were asking the court, if the court was going to make an order, to give them 2 years to implement whatever the court ordered. And the court criticized them for that, basically saying that they seem to fail to understand the desperation, the hunger that South Africans are experiencing, and to ask for 2 years in which to address these issues is absurd. And the court has, as I understand it, has given the department 4 months to come back with a plan, and it has ordered that they implement this plan immediately. So not to wait for the 4 months to start implementing a plan, but to implement it immediately, but to report back to court in 4 months on what the plan is. So the 2 years that government asked for was blown out of the water.
Sure. All right. I suppose we'll have to see how the next 4 months unfold. Brett Heron, the Secretary General of the Good Party.